Good morning. Welcome to the Civic Pulse with David Bonior and Brian Brady. We are delighted to see you today and have an amazing guest, Mr. Larry Cohen. Larry has served as the president of the 600,000 member Communications Workers of America, and he spent nearly all his adult life as a member organizer and officer. Larry is the board chair of Our Revolution, successor organization of the Bernie 2016 presidential campaign. Larry has been a member of the Democratic National Party since 2005 and was vice chair of the Unity Reform Commission, which drafted proposals adopted by the full DNC to democratize the party and the presidential nominating process. Larry, so good to see you. David, so good to see you. How are you both doing?
Great.
Thanks
Great to see you, Brian.
Trying to work up to great.
I always say I'm good in the micro and suffering in the macro here at this post-election phase. But Larry, before we dive into the election and your analysis on it, give us a little bit about your main influences. You've had a lifetime of fighting and organizing and leading some of the most powerful progressive organizations in the country. So give us a little bit of your founding influence story.
Well, David knows a lot of that story. It's a little involved, but to simplify it, I grew up in Philadelphia at a time when, thanks to the Democratic Party, because we'll probably get into some of this, the police commissioner was literally a fascist. His name was Frank Rizzo. He, within a couple of years of my sort of entry into fighting him about racism, blatant racism in the police department, and he took over, literally led the Democratic Party and got elected to 2 terms as mayor, Frank Rizzo. And that's really how I got involved. I mean, then I went on to work in different places and active in forming a union of 38,000 from scratch. We called it the State Workers Organizing Committee in New Jersey. And that's what that work, and then forming SWOC, as we called it, deliberately after Steelworkers Organizing Committee, because Trenton, New Jersey had been a huge steel town, but anyway, SWOC, we joined CWA, and we won what's called representation elections for 38,000 people at one shot. And that led to me full-time in the union, for 39 years after that. So I made it short.
And your connection to Bernie Sanders, I think a lot of us are interested in that as well. How did you get connected to Bernie?
So my passion, because of that origin, was always organizing rights. And for a bunch of reasons, I always had somewhat of a global outlook and global experience. I worked on a freighter when I was 19. It came from that, partly that, and then reading. But and it was Mediterranean. It wasn't out of U.S. So I knew that the right to organize was, even then, we're talking about the mid to late 70s, was worse in the United States than anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And the sad story would be that now it's 3 times worse than it was then. So even though I came out of the public sector for a lot of reasons, we joined the CWA to get bargaining rights and not a more traditional public sector union, because we organized in a sort of industrial way, deliberately. And my mentors at that period were amazing. They bring tears to my eyes even now. They were people who were the organizers in the 30s and 40s. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, my mindset is very much their mindset. And then, global things that happened that I experienced or read about. And so the right to organize, to get back to this, was always number one for me. The right to organize and bargain and have a contract. And Bernie, I didn't know Bernie when he was mayor at all. But when he first got elected to Congress, which David would know the year. David, what year was it?
I think Bernie was elected in the late 80s or early 90s. I can't remember.
Yeah, at the latest, it was 92. So I don't remember either. But he reached out to me, and at that time I wasn't even so at that time I was the organizing director of the National Union, and he reached out and to talk about organizing rights. Oh, the other reason would be we started a group. I was the founding chair of a group called Jobs with Justice, And part of David and I's joint history comes from that too. So anyway, not only organizing director, but he knew about Jobs with Justice because it got started with a huge bang with giant demonstrations in campaigns in many cities, particularly in the South. So anyway, he reached out as a new member of Congress. He wanted to talk about workers' rights, even though he had no standing. He wasn't even on a committee then. Thanks to David, he got on committees in the House, or he wouldn't have had the history he has, frankly, because he ran as an independent. Independents don't have to be accepted into a caucus and get committees. David was his mentor in that way. Totally. I mean, David will minimize it, I'm telling you. Anyway, so I met him because when he first came to Congress, and we became, I have to be careful, David, how I say this, but we, not like I'm friends with David, but in a different way, we became friends immediately. Bernie is like an idiot savant. He's like this. So, and the people who don't know him love that about him. But anyway, we became friends in that way, in a pretty deep way. And so when you get to 2014, he says, Larry, can you help arrange? I want to go speak around. He was well known by then. He's in the U.S. Senate, and somewhat, the way people think of Bernie today by then. And he says, I'd like to do a bunch of speaking events in the South. And I'm still president of the union. It's not like, helping him at that time was my main thing. So I said, sure. And so I got CWA union halls in Birmingham, Atlanta, I don't remember, Jackson, Mississippi. And we had little Bernie events before. It was in his head, I might run. And so I was involved in that kind of pretty deep way, way back with Bernie. And then when he decided to run, that's the more interesting part I left out. So I decided at 65, for actual, not for my own personal reasons, but not to run again. I'd been president 10 years, and I believed union leaders should leave at 65. So, and in my union, I actually got passed that the top officers, not the local people, could do whatever they wanted, but that the top officers had to retire from the pension system. We had to keep in line with what the law was about age. At age 70, I couldn't get 65. But I left at 60. I had decided I'm not going to, our members don't work, most of them, hardly any, past 65. So, it's a labor group. It's not like running for Congress. And even that, David would be the first to say, enough is enough for some of these people. But so he knew that. And so we had talked about if he ran, and then he decided on May 1st of 2015 to run. He launched a campaign. And my term was up June 8th. And on June 10th, we met. And the joke was, I said to him, all right, Bernie, I'm going to volunteer. I told everybody in the union, I'm not taking another job. I didn't leave to take another job. Got a good pension, 39 years, Social Security, blah, blah, blah. So, so I met with him in his crappy office in DC, and it was really crappy. That's the kind of style he had that people loved. It was hilarious how crummy it was. This is now his presidential campaign office. And I said to him, Bernie, I'll volunteer 10 hours a week, but I want you to commit now that we're going to build something out of this. Because I had no illusions this guy was going to beat Hillary Clinton, or, there were 5 other people running. They weren't going to beat her either. And he puts his hand on my arm like this. He says, Larry, I'm not running to be elected. I'm running to build a movement. And 2 weeks later, he was running to get elected. And 2 weeks later, it was 60 hours a week for me at the top level of that campaign. And David did this with Edwards. David doesn't like to talk about it, but David spent an entire year leading Edwards' campaign and no pay, same thing. So David would have been in my head in those moments, literally, that you could do that. And I had sort of this second or third level, not level, but position. I was not the campaign manager. So I was like,
the only 2 candidates, sorry to interrupt, Larry, who've talked about poor people in the last 20 years out of the Democratic Party. Now we just say middle class. We can't say the word poor people at the word.
We say working class in the Bernie world.
Yeah, exactly.
We say working class and middle class allies.
Wow.
We got to, David, you got to dive in. We got to dive in a little bit to this last election, though, Larry, because we need your wisdom about the future here. So
The one good news is when we didn't win, right? And after the convention, I was very involved in the convention. He did keep his word, and he, in quotes, founded there's House Ethics Committee things about the role of member, I'm sorry, Senate ethics in this case, about the role he could play. But he did found and did the launch of our revolution. And in a similar funny way, he said, Larry, you know about running organizations. Will you chair this? And so I've chaired it, nonstop till now. It's a lot different now. They have great staff, and I don't have to play that same kind of role. But he kept his word on that totally.
That's amazing,
Larry. We go back quite a long ways, and our friendship has been built on our common values, especially the organizing piece that you referred to. And I wanted to go to that if I could for a second. One of the things that we did together was you had this great idea with others of forming an organization called American Rights at Work that could argue forcefully for the rights of workers to organize and to get a first contract, as you mentioned. So I noticed in this last election, one of the couple of bright spots that were out there was that on some of the initiatives in states where people got to directly vote for propositions, they were voting to increase the minimum wage. And these were in conservative states, as well. They were voting to help organize by getting rid of what is called captured meetings by the corporations.
Captive meetings, yeah.
Yeah. So
paid family leave would be another example. Paid family leave is very popular.
And and then the sick leave, of course, was passed in a number of states. Paid sick leave.
Yeah, paid sick leave, paid family leave. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, those are really positive pieces. So I'm trying to get some positive things out of this past election, and I want to know if you wanted to speak to any of that. The other piece was I've got you here, and then I'll let you talk about these things, is the speech that Bernie Sanders gave with regard to focusing in on working people. And that should be primary. All these other good things we do on climate and other issues that are important to the party and to people are important to do. But you can't get there unless you take care of people who have, fighting every day to make sure they have enough money for gas and for food and all the other pieces that go along with trying to survive today. Only one check away in many instances from not being able to survive. So I thought that was a really good speech. He talked about oligarchs, Bernie did in this speech, and that they're not something that's just for talk about in Russia or other places. We have oligarchs here. And he used one number that I thought was really fascinating, and that's that two multi-billionaires, just two multi-billionaires, the wealthiest two, make as much money as 3 billion people on this earth, which is almost 40%. It's way out of whack. And I was really glad he made the speech. And I think it's a message to the party. And I'll stop making my speech now because I'm supposed to be asking you a question. It's a message to the party that we've got to do things differently. That has to be the focus. We lost the focus in this last election on working people. You can't have a progressive party without the support of working people. And we're going the wrong way there. So anyway, your comments and thoughts about all of that.
Okay, well, you can help guide me because when Brian asked me to move, I left my pen and paper back over there. So I just listened to all that, took it all in. I'm not sure I remember all of that. So you helped me with some of that. So let me first say, Brian asked me about, so this is yet something you didn't ask me. You didn't ask me, David. Brian had asked me about Bernie. So what David left out there, when we started American Rights at Work, and again, I was still chairing Jobs with Justice, when we started it, and I was the co-chair with another from the Service Employees Union person, and we wanted somebody to run it, and there was only one person we wanted to run it, and his name was David Bonior. I mean, literally, there was no one else in our head that could run this, and that was at a time when, we believed we could finally pass we could pass a meaningful labor law similar to every other democracy in the world. So that effort was very focused around that campaign. It came very close. It became known as the Employee Free Choice Act, passed with 60% of the House. We had 57 Democrats on the core of it, and we could not get the president or the majority leader to put it on the floor without 60 votes. It's one of the biggest failures in the history of this country that people don't write about. And it wasn't just that. It was the healthcare, the way we did healthcare. It grew into everything Obama did. But to focus on David, for working people, for me personally, there has never been a leader in the House or Senate focused on our world like David Bonior, who happens to be your co-host. Mm-hmm. So now I have to get back to what he asked me. And by now I probably don't have any idea what he asked me. Except
oligarchs basically the fact that taking something good out of this last election.
Yeah, no, I was sort of joking. I do remember that part. Yeah. So you take a state like Missouri that raised the minimum wage, that passed paid sick leave and abortion rights at a certain level. And, Harris got trounced. A much better Senate candidate, Lucas Kuntz, got trounced by basically a fascist. If Harris can call, Trump a fascist, Josh Hawley is more of a fascist than Trump. And so I think the heart of David's question there was, how do so if we just take that one state, how does all that happen? The same voters did that. So you can make that a negative, but you could also make that a positive. And it ties into Bernie's speech column in the Boston Globe. For our revolution, we, have replayed that and asked people to do surveys and sign on. It's all in the frame of that speech and that column. And so, for all of us, not just Bernie, I think when you know that, an objective fact that well over 60% of voters are working class people. They're not the employer. Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about middle class people, self-employed, or they own a grocery store. They're often in the same boat. But no, over 60%, black, brown, and white. And when you know that, what they have in common is going to work. So one of the great things about union organizing, which, lifetime for me, I still help out with it. That's how you do it. It's black, brown, and white. From the very beginning, what I would teach is what you start with is what you end with. So whatever the workplace is like, men, women, straight, gay, you've got to have all of that from the very beginning, the initial organizing committee. You don't paste it on later. And so, to David's point, to David's life, you must start out, and this is what Bernie was talking about, you must start out with that as the core. You don't paste it on later. And it's not about speech making. All this money that's spent on messaging, probably depending on how you define it, over $1 billion in the Harris campaign. I was raised in a house with 5 adults. I was the only kid. My great grandmother owned the house. My parents lived there too. It was not a hardship kind of thing. She would say, my great grandmother was an immigrant, "I'll watch your feet, not your mouth. Everybody here knows how to talk." And, that's the reality for most of us who come from, a background, a working class kind of background, right? We don't make decisions based on, what people say. It's how are they? What do they do? Their actions. And so I think that's what Bernie's really getting at here. You can't, especially with only 107 days. And I think this was the problem. She could have been absolutely perfect. And, Trump was very successful in getting her tied to Biden and running on their record. And I would actually tell you their record was better than the last two Democratic presidents for their first 3.5 years. Significantly better. David's life work, a lot of it was on, we need a balanced economy with manufacturing jobs. They actually delivered on a lot of that. And even on trade, probably the best U.S. trade rep, that's the top trade person ever, Catherine Tai. So, but nonetheless, I think, David, the issue and what Bernie is saying is, and we had, there's my dog, the Labrador. If she does it again, she'll be outside, but give her 2 chances. You have, what Bernie was really saying there in that speech and in that column was you have to center the party around working people. Doesn't mean just union rights. It means the lives of working people, black, brown, and white, immigrant, native born. You can't paste it on later. You can't say, well, here's my here's my one bill. It's about how are we centered? And we have an opportunity now because in the Democratic Party, when you lose an election, a presidential election, the actual Democratic National Committee is no longer a puppet of the White House. And puppet's the right word. I don't mind saying it even in public here. Now it has to lead itself when it elects its leaders. And that's the moment we're in. We're in that moment in 2016 when I was very involved in Keith Ellison's campaign for chair. So we're in that moment.
Larry, let me just interrupt you a second. Now I'm glad you transitioned to the party piece because it's a significant piece that you do in your life that a lot of people don't understand because party rules and all that politics is not something that's part of their life.
For good reason. Yeah.
But you do really great work in that area. And I'm going to ask you this question, and you can say what you were going to say, and then answer this if you could. What would you do as a party leader now to change the dynamics at the Democratic National Committee and on all the other committees? What do we need to do to change that, to make it work better, to be more representative, and to have a better result at the end?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is what you brought up. It's the final answer to that question. What does it mean to center the party in all? There's 57 parties. Those are what count. We talk about the party. It's really the only legal entities are the 57 state territorial parties, DC territories. There is no national party. There is a Democratic National Committee, the thing I've been on for 20 years, but that's not the party. And unlike other countries in the U.S., it's the state party. That's the legal entity. And so I think if I was, and I'm talking to people that are interested, that are running now, at least one of them, for chair of the party, and that election is not till mid or the end of February or even early March. It's not set. But the question becomes then, David, how do you center, how can the Democratic National Committee, the National Party, help center the 57 parties around working people, black, brown, and white? And then secondly, and it's totally related, there are 3,000 counties in America. There is no Democratic Party structure at all in at least 1,500 of them, maybe more. And you can't start out with a political map, even if we're only, for me, winning is secondary. What's primary is happiness. If elections don't lead to people being happier, I don't want to be involved. I'm not a junkie for politics. I might be a junkie for workers' rights, but not for politics. So if the North Star is, we'll just call it happiness for now. I mean, that's very concrete, but let's just call it people being happier. We better pay attention not only to working people, black, brown, and white, but also to 3,000 counties. And what I'm saying to now in terms of the party is there's all kinds of incentives for state parties to get some funding from the Democratic National Committee, which is mostly a fundraising machine. And I'm saying one of the incentives should be, if you have 99 counties in Iowa, David knows Iowa better than I do. Let me just get that out of the way. I know it pretty well. How many of the 99 counties do we have any kind of, party or an Iowa caucus structure in. And and we'll take a picture of that, and we will incent by funding you if you get to this benchmark and then this one. And then second, this is not rocket science. And then secondly, how many registered Democrats? Iowa has more unaffiliated than affiliated and more Republicans now than Democrats. But here's your benchmark. For each of the counties, the number of registered Democrats, and we're going to incentivize you. This is in all 57 parties, but I'm only talking about Iowa, to raise that by X percent, including the 93 counties that are rural in Iowa, not just, Polk County or Scott County, but the rural counties. And, I learned from the Bernie campaign because I was all over Iowa, particularly the first Bernie campaign, 2015. That was the first place I went with him and then without him. But I could talk to anybody in Iowa about the issues in our campaign. And almost every Republican I met, I didn't have, I'm talking about one-on-one, would say to me, if I was going to caucus with the Democrats, I would be for Bernie. I'm telling you, almost unanimously. So,
Yep.
So to David's question, taking Bernie's Boston Globe column or his speech making ever since the election day, the last 12 days or 11 days, that's what he only talks about that. But how do you make that real? I'm an organizer. You have to incentivize that, not something else. In the 3,000 counties of America and in those 57 parties. And the DNC does contribute monthly to every one of those parties.
Larry, who would you back? Ben Wickler of Wisconsin, or who's your person you want to back for that?
I'm not
position?
backing anybody at this moment. I don't think he's announced unless I missed it in the last 24 hours.
I've just seen people lobby for him on social media.
Yeah, the one who I think has announced is the Minnesota chair. And I have talked to him, but I'm not going to endorse anybody. Plenty of other people are.
Yeah.
For first of all, to see who else is running, and that's not about me. I think he's great, but I think that I have an obligation to see who's running.
Yeah.
So even Sherrod Brown gave an interview in Politico. He didn't say he's running, but he said, this is yesterday, the day before. This is what the Democratic Party needs to do. And I do think people like Sherrod are critical in talking about, crypto money. The crypto industry was a disgrace in this election.
Yeah.
Disgrace is too good a word. And when David says, the billionaires, the crypto billionaires are the worst ones. Elon Musk is the worst one, but he's huge in crypto himself. But the actual people who are only in crypto, those billionaires, and one is in prison for 10 years, but the role that Sam Bankman-Fraud, I call him, played in the primaries in 2022, that itself should have sent him to prison. They never got to any of that because they convicted him on what he did to the people who had deposited their money, but with him. But Sherrod should be literally the poster, whether he runs or not for chair of the DNC, and I'm not saying he will, of dirty money. I'm not calling it dark now. Dirty money, the worst in the world in our elections. And in Sherrod's election, this is in the general, the thing we can more easily change, we can come back to it if useful, is the primaries. The parties run their primaries. They make the rules. They decide on their nominating process. They don't even have to have a primary, and they don't in some cases. And they can rule out dirty money. And some of that has been done. It's not there at all now. In the past, it was done. So I said to Sherrod, and to his top staff, you have an obligation. $40 million was spent in less than 4 weeks to demonize, by crypto alone. There was also the McConnell super PAC, just the crypto PAC. Fair Shake, it was called, disgustingly. And then they formed another one called Demand American Jobs, David. Imagine putting $40 million of crypto money, two major firms, Ripple and Coinbase, in a super PAC where the TV ads at the bottom said Demand American Jobs, demonizing Sherrod Brown for sending jobs to China.
Yeah, disgusting.
So
If we
wait,
don't,
let
and
me,
David
can I
said to
put
me
you
one
both on
last
the
point.
spot, Larry?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Because I think a lot of our audiences, we only have about 5 minutes, or maybe we'll go a little longer today because this is too good. A lot of our audience is struggling with how do we fight right now. Also, a little, I don't know, like me, I'm also surprised at how docile or quiet some of our Democratic officials are at this moment, and I don't feel the fire you're bringing, Larry, to this show from my Democratic official at the moment. So, David, you were number 2 and 3 in Congress and for the Democratic Party. What should our elected officials be doing right now to fight, and what should we be doing to fight over the next? Let's think 6 months here. What should we be doing in the next 6 months? And I'm going to get you both to answer that one because I would like to know.
Well, I think I'll go first and I'll yield to Larry, he's our guest. But I think we need to get the message that we've just been talking about, the money piece and how the oligarchs, you can use that term here, have taken it over, and we become the anti-establishment party, which we always once were. Well, not always once were, but were at different points. And we need to move in that direction. And that means doing the things that Larry mentioned and you've talked about as well, Brian. And that is getting into those 1,500 counties in Iowa. Iowa, actually, when I was doing the Edwards campaign, I went to 67 of the 99. So I got a good feeling of what Iowa is like. And I'm not surprised, Larry, when you talk to Republicans there, they said Bernie is the kind of guy that I would vote for if I was in your party at the caucuses. Because he's anti-establishment in terms of he sees the corruption, but he also sees the injustice of the rules. And that's where you come in, where you've been a great person in leading the effort to try to change those rules. We have to change the rules institutionally. But let's focus on trying to become a party of working people again. That's really kind of, I think, key here. We can do all these other pieces that are important to people. We understand that. But you can't get anywhere. You can't have power. You won't get power unless you take care of this basic thing. And so that's where I would put our efforts. And, if you're shared as a candidate, I didn't know that. Well, I guess he isn't yet, but if he is,
No, he's not.
If he became a candidate, he's the kind of guy in philosophy that I think would help us move in that direction.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I can't add much to that.
What can people do, though? But your question was, I think, for Brian, what can people do? I mean, they can listen. I mean, there's a time for listening and trying to figure this all out. And we're still in that. But, Trump is moving fast. Okay, he's got all these positions he's filling with people who aren't competent to do them, who are actually corrupt in many ways themselves. We need people speaking out about that. So that's clearly one of the pieces. But then we have to have an attack plan to organize in each of those counties across the country, and to be a player. You would know this, Larry. Did the Vermont fellow who ran for president, I'm sorry, my mind
Dean, Howard Dean.
Yeah, Howard Dean, yeah, of course. He wanted to do that and did that to some extent, didn't he, when he was the chair?
Yeah, that's the only reason I have been on the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, is he asked me, and when he was chair, when he first became chair, and yeah, he called it 50 states. At this point, having been involved there for that many years and co-chair of the Unity Reform Commission, I call it 3,000 counties because, otherwise there is something in every one of the states, but there's no measurement about organizing. And I'm basically a mechanic. I also was a mechanic, but I didn't mean that. But, you can measure these things, as I already talked about. So we need to reorganize so that we go around and listen. This would be another thing Bernie would say. Listen, and I would say it this way: listen in all 3,000 counties.
Right.
call it listening when you have a couple focus groups. A
Right.
structured way in all 3,000 counties about party building. And in most of the counties in my world, it would be build a coalition with unaffiliated voters.
And then recruit people to run for office who are from the working class, who are nurses and teachers and mechanics and all those pieces that make the country run. I mean, this fellow who ran for the U.S. Senate as an independent in Nebraska, he did pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a complicated story for the end of your program, Brian Osborne, but I supported him.
Yeah.
And there's enormous learning from that he didn't even intend. But if we're smart, enormous learning that he ran that well. I mean, he ran 7 points behind Fisher, the incumbent, and she won, the Republican senator.
Yeah.
But he ran way ahead of Harris. And this is a guy who never ran for anything before except president of his local union.
Yeah.
And he ran as unaffiliated.
We got to run a little over because I got to ask the young men question. Age 20 to 45, we've been losing them. I was talking to my cousin, and his son is early 20s, and my neighbor. They voted for Harris, and their sons voted for Trump. And his son said, I'm about common sense and compassion. The Democrats have more compassion, but Trump has more common sense, which I find ridiculous. A guy who told you to drink bleach to cure COVID, right? But the messaging. These guys are on YouTube. They're in their own social media channels, and they're getting these messages that the Democrats have no common sense. And Trump keeps his message extremely simple for folks. How do we fight that, Larry? It seems like it's less retail and more online. What's your suggestion to get back these young men into the party?
Well, I think David helped answer it. We need young men and women, black, brown, and white, to help lead the party. And that's not some euphemism. Each of these 3,000 counties theoretically has leadership positions. And again, you can benchmark it state by state, and it's not just one leader. It's a committee, county committee, and you can benchmark exactly what you're talking about. So, rather than me, because I think, your little anecdote is the way you start, but meaning talking to somebody who's in that category who, despite his family background, voted for Trump. But on the positive side of it, the organizing side, it's that we have to be intentional, just like, as I said, in a union organizing committee, where it's essential that you're going to get crushed. But it's just as essential that in these county committees, that, number one, that we have them in the half of the country that doesn't even have one. But the makeup of that committee, like this Washington County, Maryland would be an example. It's rural Maryland. That the makeup of that committee, particularly in terms of younger people, that be intentional. And you get elected for that, but that doesn't mean you can't do something about who's on it. And so what you start with is what you end with. It's not about talking about working people or talking about younger people. It's about building political organization, even with unaffiliated younger and working people. That's what I'm saying, very intentionally, to build coalitions, just like American Rights at Work that David once led, to build coalitions with unaffiliated, black, brown, and white, working people, middle-class people, same values, and across the age spectrum, straight and gay, and that's not rocket science. You can measure it. You can send it if you're the DNC, because they have money to give out to these parties, and we can do it, and we can build it, and that's what we're going to do.
I have to give a shout out to AOC, because we've been talking mostly about old white guy leaders, but I think if you're talking about a younger generation who embodies this politics and she had a bunch of voters who were Trump voters who also voted for her, and she surveyed them online, and they said, and she's like, how did you reconcile voting for me and Trump? And they said, well, you're authentic. We like your authenticity, and you always speak your truth. I find that fascinating, that and I think she's so sophisticated in her online organizing and her in-person organizing. So I do wonder if AOC type politician is our future, who can be angry, who can be working class.
But again, in a very quick message, I would just say to you, if you told me pick one in the House, and David knows her well too. It's Pramila Jayapal, who has led the Congressional Progressive Caucus, has an amazing personal story. You know, is in her early 50s, so not as young as AOC, but she knows how to organize, and she can't be the chair again. The new chair, well, I don't want to blurt his name out. I'm not sure if he got elected yet, but the rules they have, she's termed out, but her ability to build a progressive caucus of 100, half of whom are really progressive, the other half don't want to have a primary, so they join the caucus, but her ability in organizing it in that way, as opposed to sort of a rump group, phenomenal, gives me hope. And for our revolution, I mean, she was really the North Star. As we said overtly, openly, we follow her in terms of what we can really do, because the House is the level we can, primaries in the House is sort of the highest level where our organization can make a significant difference. And so, you know, I think she's heroic. So is AOC, but I'm throwing her name out there too.
David, any final comments here too before we go into sign-off mode?
Well, I just wanted to thank Larry for doing this and for sharing his wisdom and his passion, because we need both at this juncture right now. And we've been down this alley before, and we've gotten out of it. We found the light, and we fought to get out of it, and we'll get out of this one. But it's not going to happen just because we want it to happen. It'll happen because of good organizing, smart thinking, better communication, all the pieces that we've talked about. And Larry's one of the champions in doing that, and it's been a great honor to not only know him, but to work with him for all these many years.
Thanks, Larry. I'm taking a lot out of this interview. 3,000 counties, though, is the main thing. And don't just paste on working class issues. The working class issues should be the foundation, right? I agree. Amen. 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 Well, thank you for David and myself, Brian. Larry, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining the Civic Pulse today.
My pleasure. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.